that we've done in another course, the post-graduation work permit. But since we're doing the whole, so this might be like similar to what other people might have heard in yesterday's lecture, but it's important to talk about it since it's part of that transition from study to permanent residence. So the first thing that a lot of these students are going to do is apply for a work permit after they graduate. And they do need to be in a university or college program, and we'll talk about what type of programs they need to be in to be able to make this transition. That program needs to be at least 8 months in duration, and then be able to get an open work permit, which means it's unrestricted amount of hours, not tied to one particular employer. Duration is going to vary depending on how long they studied in Canada, but for a maximum of 3 years. It's something that they can only apply for once in their lifetime. They can't go back to school and then apply for another one again later on. And luckily, since last year, the list of designated learning institutions, so DLIs, has information on which schools are eligible for the post-graduation work permit and which ones are not, which is actually very helpful because for many years we knew the general rules, but it was unclear which ones were and which ones were not. It was hard to advise clients. Even the institutions were providing clients mixed information on whether they were eligible or not. And then we would see some students from the same institution getting the post-graduation work permits and some of them not. So now we have a lot more certainty there. So in terms of eligibility, this is important. While you can be a part-time student in Canada and obtain a study permit, to get the post-graduation work permit, you needed to have been a full-time student throughout your whole program of study, except for the last semester. A lot of people have less credits due in the last semester, sometimes because of the nature of the program, sometimes because they did summer courses or things like that. So there's an exemption for that, but you should have been a full-time student before. And your program has to be at least 8 months in duration. You could have taken a medical leave, you could have taken a paternity leave if you needed to, that's fine. You are still eligible for the post-graduation work permit. It's obviously important to explain that in the application so that the officer can understand why your transcript might be missing a semester or might have a semester with less courses or something like that. And sometimes there will be documents about these leaves that you might want to include in the post-graduation application so that the officer fully understands the picture. By the time that you apply, you need to have obtained what's called a written confirmation from the designated learning institution that you are eligible to obtain your degree. So this is a letter that most institutions give saying that they so-and-so complete their program requirements on March 15, 2019. Without that letter, you can't apply. And it's very important that clients understand that this letter is different from getting your degree, from showing up at convocation and shaking hands and like getting the degree that day. It's basically, and it's not the same either as when you finish your last exam or you finish your courses. It's when everything has been evaluated and they've concluded that you meet all of the requirements for graduation. Not every single designated learning institution is eligible for a post-graduation work permit. They need to meet certain requirements. They need to be a public post-secondary institution such as a college or university, private post-secondary institution that follows those same rules, so that has been allowed by the province to grant degrees. So, the definitions are there, but as I said, the easiest is just go to the DLI list, look for the institution, and it will say whether they're eligible for the post-graduation work permit or they are not. In terms of the application, so this changed significantly this year, and it was a positive change because before we were limited to 90 days after you get that written confirmation and while you still had your valid study permit to apply for the post-graduation work permit, which was very limiting. 90 days can go by really fast. And particularly what we found was very common is that we had students who made mistakes in preparing their applications for the post-graduation work permit, submitted them. The case processing center in Canada, or sometimes abroad, took more than 3 months in process the application. And by the time that they issued the refusal, the 90 days had passed. So it was impossible for them to get the post-graduation work permit. They had to get creative and do TRPs and sometimes litigation. So it was complicated. So the government has come up with a much more flexible rule which is a 180-day rule, which we'll talk about. Where can you apply for your post-graduation work permit? Technically, you could apply within Canada if you have your valid study permit, or you could do a restoration application if your study permit has expired and it's within 90 days of that expiry. But you could also do it if you're visa exempt at the port of entry. If you're traveling, for instance, and coming back to Canada, or you could do it if you've gone back home, you could do it at a visa office, as long as you obviously comply with all of the requirements. Most people do it within Canada, and that way they're able to get implied status between the time that their study permit expires and they get the work permit. But I mean, it doesn't have to be in Canada. And it's very important that the application, and these are the things that, like, if the client comes to you before they graduate because they're interested in applying for the post-graduation work permit, you can advise them on things like make sure that in addition to all the documents, you include your final transcript and your letter of completion. And sometimes clients miss one or the other, so it's important that they have both of them there. And in terms of when they have to apply, so there's two things that they need to keep in mind. The day that they get that written confirmation letter, a 180 timer or a clock starts running from that day. So you have 180 days, 6 months, more or less, to apply for your post-graduation work permit. And by the time that you've applied for your post-graduation work permit, either your study permit needs to be valid, or you need to have held a valid study permit within the last 6 months or 180 days, okay? So it could have expired, but it needed to have been valid within the last 180 days by the time that you apply. Or you were authorized in Canada without the requirement to obtain a study permit under Section 188, 1A or B. Again, these are very specific. We're talking about family members or foreign representative, diplomats, and things like that, or people who are able to study because they fall under the Visiting Forces Act. So most people are going to fall under the first two bullet points. They either have a valid study permit or they had a valid study permit in the last 6 months, 180 days. So important, you apply within 180 days of obtaining the confirmation of graduation, and either while your study permit is valid or after it's expired. Now, there's a big incentive to applying as soon as you obtain that confirmation of graduation. And the incentive is the following. And we talked about it yesterday for those of you, who have watched that video as well or were involved in that webinar as well. You're allowed to work part-time under Section 186V. So you're allowed to work without a work permit, 20 hours while you're in an academic session as part of your study permit, but only while you're a student, okay? Once you graduate, you're not allowed to continue working. The only way that you can do so without getting your new work permit is if you've already applied for the post-graduation work permit. So a lot of students who already have employment, or they really want to start their employment right away, what they want to do is that as soon as they get that letter from the university or the college saying you've completed all of your program requirements, they want to apply that same day, the day after, as soon as possible for their post-graduation work permit. Because the day that they send that application, they can start working full-time. Even though they don't have the work permit in their hands, it's processing, they only have the study permit, they will be able to start working. Even if the study permit expires while they process the work permit application, they'll be able to continue working. And since the moment that they send that post-graduation work permit application, they can start working full-time, and that work is going to count as Canadian experience for a CEC application or for points under express entry. So that's when it's worth advising students to do it very soon after that if they want to continue to work. And sometimes we've had students basically have us prepare the application so that it's ready to go the day that they get that letter, or sometimes they have to wait a few days, interrupt their work or not start their work until that application is ready and it's submitted. So it's very so that's something else that you can advise your clients when they come to see you. We have a question. Some programs are 30 credit hours or 10 courses. University of Regina counts 3 courses full-time course load. So if a student takes 3 courses a semester, then ends up with 1 course in the last semester. Can a student take even 1 course in the last semester to complete the program? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's 2 things here. Or 3 things. So first point is that what you're pointing out, like it is the schools that determine what's full-time and it's not full-time. It's no longer mandated by IRCC. If full-time means 3 courses and you only have 1 course left on your last semester, so can you take that 1 course? Yeah, like, I mean, you could actually, I mean, that student could actually take part-time throughout their whole studies. They could take 1 course every single semester. If that's fine with the university, that's fine. There's no longer an obligation to be a full-time student to be able to maintain your student status. Now, you won't be able to work if you're part-time during your studies, except for the last semester, and you won't be eligible for the post-graduation work permit. But sticking to your scenario that you're saying, if they were full-time, so let's say they were taking the 3 courses throughout their studies, and they only have 1 left for the last semester, yeah, they take that 1 last course in the last semester. They are allowed to work because it's their last semester, the 20 hours per week, and then they are eligible for the post-graduation work permit because there's that exception. On the last semester, you can be part-time and a part-time student, and then you can still be eligible to work on the post-graduation work permit. In terms of duration of the post-graduation work permit, it's very tied to the program of study. So if you have a program that's less than 2 years, so let's say 8 months to 23 months, let's say, you're going to get, in theory, you're going to get that as your duration. So if you study for 1 year, you'll get 1 year. If you study for 1.5 years, you'll get it 1.5 years. Keep in mind that it's the program duration. So there might be programs that are completed in 1.5 years, but there's no breaks. And in reality, it's a 2-year program. Or sometimes it could be a 2-year program that you complete in 2 years, but someone has completed it sooner because they took summer courses or they took extra courses during the semester. So they should, like, the officers should go with the program duration. And whenever we send these applications, we bring that to their attention. That's what they should be doing. And sometimes there's inconsistencies, but I mean, if you feel that your client is entitled to the, so let's say like the 3-year work permit because they studied 2 years or more, then I mean, you should bring that to the attention of the officers at the beginning, and then obviously you might want to have that reviewed if they don't get that time. But I have seen some programs that are 1-year masters, and some people get a 12-month post-graduation work permit, and some people get the 3 years because it's a master's. So again, there's still a little bit of uncertain. I mean, there's not consistency always with the officers who review this, but at least know what they're entitled to. When if a client, for instance, if you have one client who says, I know some people in my program get 3 years because this is a master's, I did 12 months of studying, or I did like, how much am I allowed to get? What I normally advise them is that you'll probably get 1 year. So I try to be very conservative. I always try to like manage client expectations. We'll see. I mean, we can ask for more. We can say that normally this people who do this program are eligible for the 3 years and see if they give it to you, but be prepared to only get 1 year. And so that's what I normally do. So if it's less than 2 years, normally you get the duration of the program. If the program is 2 years or more, you should get the maximum, which is 3 years. And if a student did, let's say, 1 year program and then another 1 year program, then they should be able to get the 3 years if they did those 2 programs within a period of 2 years. Okay, so we have some questions. If a post-graduation work permit is approved 3 months later after the application, does the timeline of post-graduation work permit start from the day of the approval, or is it applied retroactive? Not sure I understand what do they mean by the timeline of the post-graduation work permit. Do you mean the timeline of their work in Canada for the purpose of Canadian experience? Or I think okay, I think I see what you mean. When do they, so let's say if they're going to give them a 3-year post-graduation work permit, when do they start that timeline? So I think that might be the question. So let's say client graduates in May, applies in May for the post-graduation work permit, gets that permit in August. let's say it's 2019. Are they going to give them until August of 2022? Or are they going to give them until May of 2022? Normally, what I've seen is that they give them the 3 years from the time that the permit is approved. Again, there's been inconsistencies, and sometimes I've seen some of the 1-year work permits that they do make them like very strict from like the time that they applied. But I mean, in most cases, I've seen that it's from the time of approval that they give them the 1 year, the year and a half, or the 3 years. I mean, I think I've seen that more than the other scenario, and this sometimes is helpful because if you have a client who only has 1 year, it's obviously helpful if they give them those extra 3 months to find a job and stuff like that. But normally I do see the approvals from the time that it's approved. Now, if it was one of those that involved a TRP and it took a long time to be approved, then maybe they might actually like limit it to a little bit less. And yeah, so like, I mean, answering the question that Sahid has right now, so a student may be able to get a little bit additional time while they process. Yep, that is correct. One important thing to keep in mind in this duration is the passport expiry date and the impact that it might have on the post-graduation work permits. I might have a client who's eligible for a 3-year post-graduation work permit, but their passport expires in a year. So when they get the post-graduation work permit, it says only 1 year. And normally it says, I forget what the exact remark is, but basically expiry limited due to passport expiry date or expiry date set to passport expiry date. It could say one of those things, or maybe they don't put the remark, but in those cases, it's fairly simple. If your client was eligible for an extra 2 years, then once they renew their passport and close to their work permit expiry date, you can send, or even a couple of months before, you can send the application for the new post-graduation work permit, prove that they were entitled to the 3 years, and then get the extra 2 years that they should have been entitled to. And that normally goes quite smoothly as long as they've included all the documents and as long as they've paid the right fees. So the 155 for the work permit and 100 for the post-graduation work permit. Now, it's important that in those applications, they do include all the documentation that they need. So they do have to satisfy the officer that they were originally eligible for a 3-year post-graduation work permit. So make sure you include the original acceptance letter from the institution that says how long the program was, the final transcripts, the letter that says when they completed their studies, and any evidence that it was supposed to be let's say a 4-year program, and that's why they were eligible for the 3 years, and obviously explain that it was limited because of the passport expiry date. In terms of spouse and children, and we'll be, I know we're doing like a little bit of a review of what we did in a previous course, but we'll get to the next step in a few slides. You might have the situation of clients who are in Canada with their spouse, sometimes with their children, while they were students. And when you're a student in a college or a university, you can get an open work permit for your spouse, and your children can go to school either under a study permit if they applied for one, or under a visitor record, because Section 30 of the Act, Sub 2, allows minors to attend preschool, primary, or secondary level if they're accompanying a parent who's studying or working. Now, what happens if I'm the student, I'm graduating, I want to keep my family in status? So children is fairly simple. You just send a study permit extension or a visitor record extension, and they'll be able to continue studying, because the same rights that they had as accompanying children of a student, they have the same rights as accompanying children of a worker when you apply for a post-graduation work permit. With the spouse, it's a little bit different. So if you're the spouse of a student in a college or university, you have a right for an open spousal work permit. So that's fairly simple. When you're the spouse of a worker, you have the right to a spousal open work permit, but only if your spouse has a job in a NOC 0A or B occupation. So it has to be a professional or technical occupation. If they're working as a receptionist or as a cashier or as a bank teller, you're not allowed to the open spousal work permit, or if they're unemployed, you're not allowed for that either. So it's very important that if the student who's now transitioning to a post-graduation work permit has that job offer, that they include that job offer in the application for the spousal open work permit. Or if they've been working for that employer, let's say while they were students and they have some pay stubs, include that as well. But you need to show that, and that job offer needs to show that it's a professional job. And if it's not in that job offer, then get another letter from the